Have you ever thought that something as simple as your sweat could start a war? Not a fist fight, not a personal dispute, but a galactic-level diplomatic incident. What if your body, without your permission, sent a signal across species lines, igniting instincts so deep and sacred that they shattered centuries of peacekeeping protocols? Would you blame biology or destiny? Now, close your eyes, metaphorically, and picture this: a vast space station suspended in orbit between twin suns. Nexus Station. A gleaming, spiraling construct of steel, crystal, and atmospheric domes. A city among the stars, housing diplomats, scientists, and soldiers from over 100 known species. Peace built this place. But it runs on tension, politics, and precision. And in the dead center of it all, in a subterranean level few ever see, a man works out in solitude. Ethan Cole, lieutenant-class human diplomat, stood alone in the dimly lit gym. The kind of space designed more for utility than aesthetics. Sweat glistened on his skin, beating along the ridges of his chest and sliding down his spine in glimmering rivulets. His breath was steady, his focus unshakable. He wasn't just lifting weights, he was grounding himself in something physical, something human. The gravity generators hummed beneath his feet, calibrated to 1.1 Earth standard. Just enough resistance to make each deadlift feel like a challenge. He liked that. He liked feeling sore afterward. It reminded him of who he was before the suits, before the meetings, before the polished words and neutral expressions. He dropped the barbell with a dull thud and reached for his towel, wiping his brow and then dragging it through his damp chestnut hair. The air around him carried the heavy scent of exertion, salt, testosterone, determination. Then the doors hissed open. He didn't look at first. Few people ever came here this late cycle. But then a scent hit him, subtle, sharp, sweet, like citrus kissed with ozone, unfamiliar, alien. His blue eyes flicked toward the door, and she walked in. She moved with the grace of someone born in lesser gravity, fluid, near floating, but each step held intent. Her skin shimmered an emerald green beneath the gym's sterile lights, her silver-white hair cascading like liquid metal down her back. Athletic, poised, unreadable. Ethan straightened unconsciously. He'd seen many Vidians before, of course. Nexus Station was a hub. But this one wasn't just another diplomat. She radiated something different, something instinctual. She met his eyes, nodded once. "Good cycle," she said in flawless English, her accent a melodic edge. "Good cycle," he replied, returning the nod, trying to refocus. She walked past him toward the cardio units, her lithe figure outlined by the fitted training uniform that Vidian standard military required. Gray tank top, compression shorts, neutral, efficient. But Ethan couldn't stop noticing the rhythm of her movement, how she breathed, how her body seemed attuned. He turned back to the weights, finished another set, kept his head down, but he could feel it, the awareness, her presence like a second gravity well in the room. Then he heard it, a soft gasp. He looked up. She was frozen in place halfway through stretching, her arms held awkwardly in front of her, palms trembling. "You okay?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. Her eyes, silver and piercing, flicked toward him, wide and confused. She began, then shuddered. Her voice was thinner, ragged. "Something's wrong." He took a cautious step forward, alert but not alarmed. "Do you need medical?" "No," she snapped, recoiling. "No doctors. Just give me a moment." He stopped immediately, raising his hands in the universal signal of respect. She clutched her abdomen, then her chest. Then something changed. Before his eyes, her form began to shift. Her already athletic body subtly but rapidly transformed. Hips flared, her chest expanded, the fabric of her uniform strained under sudden pressure. Even her voice, when she gasped again, was different. It was surreal, beautiful, frightening. "What the hell?" Ethan whispered. The woman, barely able to contain the changes, looked at him with a mix of horror and shame. "It's a biological reaction," she said, biting each word. "Triggered." "By what?" Ethan asked. Her eyes met his, and something primal passed between them. "You." Silence. Ethan blinked. "Me?" "My species," she explained with effort, "enters a reproductive acceleration phase when exposed to certain stimuli, rare, supposed to be regulated, but your scent, your sweat, it mimics our mating pheromones. Too close, too strong." He stepped back. I'm sorry, I didn't know." "Of course not," she snapped, then softened. "It's not your fault, it just happened." She closed her eyes, steadying herself. Her breathing was ragged. Her body, now visibly different, trembled with restrained tension. "I need to get back to my quarters," she whispered, "before anyone else sees this." Ethan hesitated. Then, silently, he removed his jacket and handed it to her. She wrapped it around her waist, hiding as much of the transformation as possible. "Thank you," she murmured. "This is not how I imagined meeting one of Earth's diplomats." Ethan offered a small smile. "Trust me, this isn't in any handbook." They moved quickly through the quiet corridors, the echoes of their footsteps chasing them down the curving hallways of Nexus Station. Every turn they took felt like a countdown. Every passing officer, a potential scandal. She leaned on him slightly as they reached her door. "My name is Saralyn," she said. "Scientist, diplomatic attaché, and currently a walking violation of half a dozen protocols." "Ethan," he replied, human, confused, and somehow still trying to be a gentleman. The door slid open. She stepped inside, turned. "You didn't have to help me," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he said, just as softly. The door closed between them. He stood there for a moment, the scent of citrus ozone still clinging to the air. He didn't know that behind the sealed door, Saralyn was already sending an encrypted signal to her father, to the High Council, to her world, and neither of them knew. That the moment his sweat hit her lungs, history had shifted. A man, a woman, a scent, and now an ancient tradition reawakened. What would you do if someone told you that a moment of kindness, a gesture as simple as giving someone your jacket, was now considered a violation of interstellar protocol? What if you were summoned not as a hero, but as a threat? Ethan Cole didn't sleep that night. He paced the narrow confines of his quarters, thoughts looping with the rhythm of the recycled air systems. The moment kept replaying in his mind. The transformation, Saralyn's trembling voice, the look in her silver eyes. A look that wasn't just confusion or fear, but something deeper, something almost sacred. He had only meant to help, to protect, to do what any decent human being would do when someone was in trouble. But now, a summons was flashing on his console. High Council session. Attendance, mandatory. Appearance, immediate. He hadn't even had time to change. Still in his black undershirt, boots, and station sweats, he threw on a formal jacket and walked the long corridor toward the administrative wing of Nexus Station. The halls felt colder now, like the walls themselves knew something had shifted. 2 Vidian guards flanked the doorway to the chamber. They didn't speak, they didn't nod. They simply scanned him and opened the doors. Inside, silence greeted him. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that wraps around your throat like a political noose. Ambassador Leora Gray sat at the Central Human Delegation desk, posture immaculate, face carved from centuries of diplomacy. To her right stood a delegation of Vidian representatives, 6 of them, their green skin glowing faintly under the council lights. At the center of their group stood a tall figure in ceremonial silver armor, robes flowing over pauldrons etched with ancient Vidian runes. His presence silenced the room further. Ethan had never met Grand Marshal Voren in person. He had only seen hollows, read files, heard hushed conversations in the diplomat lounge. Voren wasn't just Saralin's father, he was a war hero, a reformer, a cultural guardian, the kind of man whose voice could reshape treaties or shatter alliances. "Lieutenant Cole," Voren said, without looking directly at him. "You are late." Ethan stood tall. "I was not informed this was an emergency council." Voren's eyes narrowed. "It became one the moment you triggered a sacred biological right in my daughter." The words fell like blades. Ambassador Gray stiffened beside him. "With respect, Marshal Voren, no treaties were violated, no laws." "No laws?" Voren snapped, turning fully now to face them. "My daughter underwent a sacred transformation triggered by human biochemistry, unbidden, unprepared, in the presence of an unvetted male diplomat. You think laws are the only measure of consequence?" Ethan swallowed hard. "She was in distress. I helped her." "She was not simply in distress," Voren hissed. "She was in heat." The chamber fell into a vacuum of breathless stillness. "Would you speak up now, or stay silent, knowing the next words could cost your entire career?" Ethan's voice came out lower than he expected. "I didn't know my presence, my sweat, would cause anything. I didn't mean harm." Voren took a long step forward. "Intent is irrelevant. The bond has been initiated." "The what?" Ethan asked. A Vidian woman from the delegation stepped forward, her voice calm but sharp. "Our species, when entering the mating cycle, forms what we call bioenergetic synchrony. It's rare, sacred, and irreversible once initiated." Ambassador Gray interjected quickly. "With due respect, no such compatibility between human and Vidian has ever been documented. If there is a scientific explanation, we should—" Voren raised a hand. "This is not about science. This is about tradition." He turned to Ethan. "You have corrupted something ancient, human, whether you meant to or not. And Saralyn, she is not just any daughter, she is my heir, and she was betrothed." Ethan froze. Betrothed. "She didn't mention that," he said quietly. "She would not. The agreement was private, sealed until the union ceremony. But now, it is nullified. Her transformation invalidates it." Voren looked away for the first time. "There are laws, old ones, rituals to purge the bond. But they come at cost, her honor, her future, my legacy." Ethan stood frozen in place. He felt like someone had set a fire under his ribs and sealed off the oxygen. None of this made sense. None of it was fair. And then the doors opened again. All heads turned. Saralyn entered the chamber, robed in traditional Vidian ceremonial fabric, though her form still bore the unmistakable curves of her altered state. Her posture was regal, but her eyes were defiant. "Father," she said calmly, "you are speaking of me as though I am not present." Voren's jaw clenched. "This is not your place." "It is now," she replied. "A biological bond has been formed, yes, but it was not chosen. It was a reaction." Voren's voice was colder now. "Reaction or not, it exists, and the conclave demands resolution." Saralyn stepped closer to Ethan, standing beside him, her hand brushing his for the briefest of moments. "There is another path," she said. "One the Council has forgotten, the trials of compatibility." Gasps rang out from the Vidian delegation. Even Ambassador Gray blinked. "The trials?" Voran said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They still exist," Saralyn said, "and they are part of our law. If the bond is tested and fails, it is deemed null. If it succeeds," she turned to Ethan, "it becomes unbreakable." He met her eyes. "What are the trials?" "They test us," she said, "in 3 ways: body, mind, purpose, and they're watched by both our people." Ethan didn't look away. "Then I accept." The room burst into low murmurs. Ambassador Gray stepped close to him, whispering harshly, "Ethan, you don't know what you're agreeing to. These are ancient rituals, some dangerous. You could be permanently bonded." "I know," he said. "But it's better than this silence, better than being treated like a problem." He turned back to Saralyn. "I'll take your trials." She nodded once. "Then we begin at first light." The council was adjourned. Formal documentation would follow. Witnesses would be gathered. Ethan left the chamber not as a diplomat, but as something else entirely. A participant in a rite older than his species' membership in the Galactic Order. And somewhere deep inside, beyond the fear and confusion, a spark had lit. Not love, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, the start of something just as powerful. What makes a connection real? Is it choice or biology? Is it the moment we say yes, or the instant our bodies respond before our minds catch up? The lights in Ethan Cole's quarters dimmed automatically as station night fell over Nexus. But he didn't rest. Not after the council. Not after that word echoed again and again in his mind. Unbreakable. He leaned over his data terminal, eyes scanning the thin, ancient script of Vidian law. Ambassador Gray had sent a secure file, an internal archive not meant for human eyes. Trials of compatibility. A ceremonial path lost in layers of myth, more cultural relic than living practice. And yet tomorrow it would begin again. His communicator buzzed once, a message, unsigned. But he didn't need a signature to know who it was from. The first trial is of the body. It tests rhythm, balance, energy. Move with me, trust your breath. And remember, they are watching. Ethan exhaled. He hadn't even seen Saralyn since they left the chamber. Yet her voice haunted every silent moment since. He didn't know what she wanted from him, not truly. But somehow it didn't matter. He had agreed, and that meant something. The next morning, as the twin suns aligned over the station's eastern orbital arc, Ethan arrived at the ceremonial chamber. It had been transformed overnight. A domed space once used for diplomatic negotiations now pulsed with bioluminescent Vidian symbols and faint clouds of incense curling like whispers through the air. He wore the ceremonial uniform delivered to his room, a form-fitting black suit with blue trace lines mirroring the flow of neural paths. It hugged his body like memory foam woven from light. No armor, no weapons, just his breath, his heartbeat, his willingness. Across the chamber, Saralyn emerged from a side entrance. She was radiant. Her suit matched his in design, but glowed with green and silver filaments. Her silver hair had been braided and adorned with crystalline beads that shimmered in rhythm with the low, ambient music already playing in the background. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Grand Marshal Voran's voice rose from the high dais above. "The first trial begins now. Witness the test of attunement. They will move together, without instruction, without speech. If the bond is real, it will reveal itself." A raised platform at the center of the room lit up, its surface shifting with holographic patterns and pulsing light. The music deepened, slow and resonant, vibrating through Ethan's bones. He stepped onto the platform. Saralyn joined him. They stood face to face, a breath apart. Would you let yourself be seen without words? Let your body speak for you, even if the whole world was watching? Ethan looked into her eyes. "Ready," he whispered. "As I'll ever be," she replied. Then the rhythm changed. Light patterns swirled beneath their feet, slow spirals, quick flickers, a dance only understood by instinct. Saralyn moved first, her steps graceful and deliberate, her arms arcing with a kind of fluid certainty. Ethan mirrored her, stumbling at first, his body unsure, mechanical. He'd never danced in his life, not properly, not like this. He tried to remember the message. Move with me. Trust your breath. So he did. He stopped thinking. He followed. Their steps began to sync. Her lead, his reply, his pause, her return. Each motion echoed in the other, like ripples meeting across a still pond. The music climbed. The patterns changed. Then something strange happened. As they danced, a heat spread through Ethan's chest. Not fever, not exertion, but warmth. It pulsed in time with the rhythm, and when his hand brushed Saralyn's, the heat surged. Her eyes widened. She felt it too, bioenergetic resonance. The term flickered in his memory, a shared current of energy, rare, sacred, and, according to Vidian tradition, a sign of profound compatibility. Ambassador Gray stepped close to him, whispering harshly, "Ethan, you don't know what you're agreeing to. These are ancient rituals, some dangerous. You could be permanently bonded. I know," he said. "But it's better than this silence, better than being treated like a problem." He turned back to Saralyn. "I'll take your trials." She nodded once. "Then we begin at first light." The council was adjourned. Formal documentation would follow. Witnesses would be gathered. Ethan left the chamber not as a diplomat, but as something else entirely. A participant in a rite older than his species' membership in the Galactic Order. And somewhere, deep inside, beyond the fear and confusion, a spark had lit. Not love, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, the start of something just as powerful. What makes a connection real? Is it choice or biology? Is it the moment we say yes, or the instant our bodies respond before our minds catch up? The lights in Ethan Cole's quarters dimmed automatically as station night fell over Nexus. But he didn't rest. Not after the council. Not after that word echoed again and again in his mind. Unbreakable. He leaned over his data terminal, eyes scanning the thin, ancient script of Vidian law. Ambassador Gray had sent a secure file, an internal archive not meant for human eyes. Trials of compatibility. A ceremonial path lost in layers of myth, more cultural relic than living practice. And yet tomorrow it would begin again. His communicator buzzed once, a message, unsigned. But he didn't need a signature to know who it was from. The first trial is of the body. It tests rhythm, balance, energy. Move with me, trust your breath. And remember, they are watching. Ethan exhaled. He hadn't even seen Saralyn since they left the chamber. Yet her voice haunted every silent moment since. He didn't know what she wanted from him, not truly. But somehow it didn't matter. He had agreed, and that meant something. The next morning, as the twin suns aligned over the station's eastern orbital arc, Ethan arrived at the ceremonial chamber. It had been transformed overnight. A domed space once used for diplomatic negotiations now pulsed with bioluminescent Vidian symbols and faint clouds of incense curling like whispers through the air. He wore the ceremonial uniform delivered to his room, a form-fitting black suit with blue trace lines mirroring the flow of neural paths. It hugged his body like memory foam woven from light. No armor, no weapons, just his breath, his heartbeat, his willingness. Across the chamber, Saralyn emerged from a side entrance. She was radiant. Her suit matched his in design, but glowed with green and silver filaments. Her silver hair had been braided and adorned with crystalline beads that shimmered in rhythm with the low, ambient music already playing in the background. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Grand Marshal Voren's voice rose from the high dais above. The first trial begins now. Witness the test of attunement. They will move together, without instruction, without speech. If the bond is real, it will reveal itself. A raised platform at the center of the room lit up, its surface shifting with holographic patterns and pulsing light. The music deepened, slow and resonant, vibrating through Ethan's bones. He stepped onto the platform. Saralyn joined him. They stood face to face, a breath apart. Would you let yourself be seen without words? Let your body speak for you, even if the whole world was watching? Ethan looked into her eyes. Ready, he whispered. As I'll ever be, she replied. Then the rhythm changed. Light patterns swirled beneath their feet, slow spirals, quick flickers. A dance only understood by instinct. Saralyn moved first, her steps graceful and deliberate, her arms arcing with a kind of fluid certainty. Ethan mirrored her, stumbling at first, his body unsure, mechanical. He'd never danced in his life, not properly, not like this. He tried to remember the message. Move with me. Trust your breath. So he did. He stopped thinking. He followed. Their steps began to sync. Her lead, his reply, his pause, her return. Each motion echoed in the other, like ripples meeting across a still pond. The music climbed. The patterns changed. Then something strange happened. As they danced, a heat spread through Ethan's chest. Not fever, not exertion, but warmth. It pulsed in time with the rhythm, and when his hand brushed Saralyn's, the heat surged. Her eyes widened. She felt it too, bioenergetic resonance. The term flickered in his memory, a shared current of energy, rare, sacred, and, according to Vidian tradition, a sign of profound compatibility. The music built. Their movements grew more intimate. Not sensual, not overt, but deeply attuned. Like the gravity of one pulled gently toward the orbit of the other. Their palms touched. Their steps synchronized so perfectly that the holographic floor beneath them reacted, its colors merging into a single spiral of white and violet light. Around them, the observers leaned in. Ambassador Gray's fingers tightened around her data slate. Voren sat motionless, expression unreadable. The final note of the music rang out, deep and pure, and the light stilled. Ethan and Saralyn stood inches apart, breathing hard, palms still connected, their suits flickering with the afterglow of whatever force had passed between them. The silence lasted too long. Then Voren's voice broke it. The trial is complete, synchronization confirmed. The attendants stepped forward, gesturing for them to step down. As Ethan walked beside Saralyn, neither said a word, but something had changed. Later, in the quiet hallway outside the ceremonial chamber, she spoke first. You felt it too. He nodded. What was it? Saralyn looked up at him. Something even our scientists don't understand. The resonance. It only happens in bonds that go beyond intention, beyond desire, into the realm of what simply is. He didn't answer right away. He remembered her face during the trial, the way she moved, the way his own body moved without conscious thought, and something tightened in his chest. Not fear, not even attraction, but recognition, like they were two verses from the same song, only just now finding harmony. So, what happens when a trial proves too much? or prove something you weren't ready to face. That night, as Ethan returned to his quarters, a second message awaited him. Tomorrow is the trial of memory. Let me show you who I truly am, if you're willing to see. If someone offered to step into your memories, every victory, every failure, every shame, would you let them? Would you unlock everything, even the parts you've buried so deep you forgot they still hurt? Ethan Cole stood at the threshold of the memory chamber, palms damp despite the cool air washing over his skin. The room was unlike anything he had seen before on Nexus Station. It wasn't made of metal or crystal or technology. It was alive. The walls pulsed with soft light, a gentle amber glow radiating from living vines that curled along the chamber's surface. At the center stood two seats, high-backed, carved from some organic material that shimmered faintly when touched. Between them floated a sphere of bioluminescent mist, swirling slowly as if breathing. Sarah Lynn waited inside. She was already seated, hands resting calmly on the armrests, eyes closed as though in meditation. She wore a new version of the ceremonial suit, this one woven with filaments of deep green and gold. When she sensed his presence, she opened her eyes. "You came," she said simply. "Couldn't let you see all my embarrassing moments without me here to narrate," he replied with a tight smile. She didn't laugh, but her eyes softened. "This trial is different. You will see what I see, and I will see you." Ethan looked at the other chair. It looked simple enough, but he felt like stepping into it meant walking naked into a storm. He sat. A soft hum filled the room. The sphere between them pulsed brighter. Tendrils of glowing mist extended toward their temples. They didn't move, didn't need to. The threads found their mark. There was no pain, only memory. Suddenly, he was no longer in the chamber. He was standing in a field beneath two green moons. A younger Sarah Lynn ran through grass that shimmered like starlight, laughing as the wind whipped her hair. He could feel what she felt, freedom, innocence, a moment before responsibility. Then it shifted. Now they were inside a vast, cold hall. Her father stood before her, distant and commanding. Sarah Lynn, barely into adulthood, held up a datapad, explaining some biological discovery. Her voice was full of fire, but Voren's response was silence, disapproval. She wilted, even as she smiled. Another shift. Sarah Lynn in a sterile lab, alone. She worked late into the night surrounded by samples and silence. Her hands trembled. Her eyes burned with exhaustion. Not from work, but from proving she belonged. Proving she wasn't just the daughter of. He wanted to reach out, say something, anything, but the memory didn't allow interaction. Then the light dimmed, and suddenly it was his turn. Sarah Lynn's consciousness entered his. He felt it. The weight of her attention, gentle but unyielding. Like sunlight through stained glass. Warm, but able to see everything. They were in a classroom. Earth, years ago. Ethan sat in the back, pretending to read. The teacher was talking about the Great Unification Accords. But Ethan wasn't listening. He was staring at the empty chair beside him. His brother's chair. A flash of funeral colors. His mother's shaking hands. His father, silent. Then, the academy. Military preparation. Ethan running drills, bruises forming across his arms, but his eyes focused on something ahead, something not yet broken. The quiet vow he whispered at night, "I'll never let anyone vanish again." He had built himself like a wall. Now she could see it. The last memory came slowly. Ethan on Nexus Station, weeks before the incident. Alone. Sitting in the viewing deck at shift change, staring at Earth's sun rendered as a distant point. No family, no messages, just silence. A man shaped by duty and absence, the threads disconnected, the light dimmed. They were back in the chamber. But neither of them was the same. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Saralyn said quietly, "Your silence is very loud." He looked at her. "Your loneliness is sharper than I thought." She nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I didn't know if I wanted to let you see that." Neither did I. They stood together. The walls seemed to pulse differently now, warmer, more vibrant. Ethan broke the silence. "So, did we pass?" From behind them, a low chime echoed. Ambassador Leora and Grand Marshal Voren entered. This time, Voren didn't carry his usual frost. "The second trial is complete," he said. "Your memories are compatible. Not perfectly aligned, but complementary. That is rare." Saralyn turned to him. "You didn't object." Voren studied her face for a long moment. "I saw what you let him see. That was more than tradition ever required." He left without another word. Later, in the corridor, Ethan and Saralyn walked side by side. "I didn't think it would feel like that," he said. "Not just seeing your life, but feeling it." "That's what makes it dangerous," she said. "Most bonds fail here, not because of what they show, but because of what they fear to show. And yet," Ethan said, "we're still standing." They reached a quiet junction where their quarters split. Saralyn paused. "Tomorrow is the final trial," she said. "We speak our truths, our desires, our intent, before the crystals." He nodded. "Ethan," she hesitated, then continued, "if your answer changes by then, if you realize this isn't what you want, say so. I won't hold it against you." He looked at her, really looked. Not the diplomat, not the alien, just the person who had let him witness everything unspoken in her soul. "I think," he said, "for the first time in a long time, I actually know what I want." She didn't reply, but her eyes shimmered. What drives a person to stay when walking away would be so much easier? Is it loyalty, guilt, or is it something deeper, something that even logic cannot explain? The final trial waited. Ethan Cole stood in front of a pair of crystalline pedestals, each glowing faintly with an inner pulse that reminded him of a heartbeat. The ceremonial chamber had been reconfigured again, less ornate this time, more solemn, quieter. As if the room itself respected the weight of the moment, the floor beneath him was etched in Vidian script. The air held the scent of minerals and time. And just behind him, Ambassador Leora waited, stoic as ever. A silent witness to what might be one of the most culturally significant events between their two species in decades. Saralyn stood across from him, facing the other pedestal. No music, no dance, no memory sharing. This trial wasn't about motion or history, it was about choice. Grand Marshal Voren stood nearby, flanked by a half-dozen Vidian observers in formal garb. There was tension in his posture, but less than before. Whether that meant resignation or reluctant hope, Ethan couldn't tell. Voren spoke first. "The trial of purpose is the final step. You will each place your hand on your crystal. Speak your truth, your intent, what you seek from this bond and what you offer in return." He gestured toward Ethan. "You may begin." Ethan inhaled, stepped forward, and placed his palm against the glowing surface of the crystal. It was warm, almost like skin. A faint vibration traveled up his arm, into his chest. His heart beat in response. "I seek connection," he said, his voice steady. "Not out of obligation, not because of biology, but because I've spent most of my life learning to build bridges between cultures, and never once thought to build one for myself." He paused, glancing at Saralyn. "I've felt alone for a long time, maybe longer than I ever admitted. I came to Nexus Station as a diplomat, but the truth is, I was hiding behind the mission. I was keeping people at a safe distance, using duty as armor. Then she walked into the gym, and everything changed. A murmur rose behind him. He ignored it. I didn't choose to start this, but I choose to continue it. Not because we were forced together, but because when I saw her memories, I didn't just understand her. I respected her, and I saw the courage it takes to be more than what people expect you to be. He pressed his hand more firmly against the crystal. So I stand here not just as a representative of Earth. I stand here as a man who is ready to walk beside her, not in ceremony, not in ritual, but in purpose. I want to be her partner, in everything, even if the rest of the galaxy doesn't understand it yet. The crystal flared, a white-blue light rippling through its core. Voren nodded once. Sarah Lynn, she stepped forward, her face unreadable, but her voice was clear. I seek understanding, she began. Since I was a child, I've lived in the shadow of expectations, daughter of a war hero, heir to a tradition older than memory. But I chose science. I chose questions. I wanted to know how different we really are, or if that difference is only skin and stars. She looked at Ethan. Your scent triggered my transformation. But it wasn't your body that changed me, it was your kindness, your hesitation, the way you looked at me, not as a symbol of some alien culture, but as a person who was terrified and didn't want to be alone. She placed her hand against the crystal. I offer more than compatibility. I offer curiosity, commitment, and a desire to build something new, not just between us, but between our people. I want our bond to be more than proof of biology. I want it to be the start of understanding. Her crystal responded with a radiant pulse of gold and green. The chamber held its breath. Then the light from both crystals surged, two beams of energy rising upward, intertwining in the air like strands of DNA. Where they met, the room shimmered with a harmonic tone that resonated through the bones of everyone present. The crystals had spoken. Voren stepped forward. The trial of purpose is complete. The bond is acknowledged. Ambassador Leora gave a slight nod. Ethan exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Sarah Lynn stepped down from her pedestal, meeting him in the center of the chamber. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. He reached for her hand. She took it. And for the first time since this began, there were no walls between them. Later, in a quiet chamber overlooking the planetary rings, they sat together in silence. Not holding, not speaking, just existing. Two souls that had been strangers, now aligned. You know, Ethan said, this all started because I didn't shower after the gym. Sarah Lynn smiled softly. That detail will not be included in the diplomatic record. What will be? That the first true human-Vidian bond wasn't forged by treaties or strategy, she said. It was forged by accident and sealed by choice. What happens when a personal choice becomes a political storm? What do you do when the world you just discovered with someone collides with the world that built you? It began as a whisper. By the time Ethan Cole returned to his quarters, the news had already spread, across encrypted channels, between decks and departments, from the ambassadorial wing to the science quarters. Everyone on Nexus Station had heard some version of it. A human and a Vidian. Bonded, not as allies, not as researchers, but as something older, deeper, something sacred. Ethan paced his room in the half-darkness, watching the stars drift past the narrow window. He didn't need to check his messages. There would be a flood of them. Requests for statements, coded warnings from Earth's political attachés, subtle demands to explain himself. But none of that mattered right now, because when she knocked, he opened the door without hesitation. Saralyn stood there, her robe wrapped tightly around her frame, eyes shadowed but steady. She stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. "There's a council meeting," she said. "I figured. They want you reassigned, off station, effective immediately." He blinked. "That fast?" She nodded. "The bond makes you a threat," she added. "Not in their words, but in their eyes." He laughed, low and tired. Amazing how terrified people get when something new doesn't fit the chart. "They don't care about us," she said. "They care about what we represent. Biology rewriting diplomacy, emotion interrupting protocol." He turned to her. "Do you regret it?" "No." Neither did he. Later, as the council convened in the Hall of Accord, Ethan and Saralyn stood side by side beneath the central dome, a vast structure lined with the flags and emblems of the Galactic Coalition. The room was filled, not just with officials, but with something heavier. Expectation, division. Ambassador Leora took the floor first. "Colleagues, friends, today we face an unprecedented situation. A human diplomat has completed a recognized Vidian bond trial. According to their law, that bond is now sacred. According to ours, it is undefined." The murmurs began. Vorin stepped forward next. His presence, as always, silenced the room. "I did not seek this outcome. I did not approve it. But I have seen it. I have witnessed their truth. And I cannot, will not, deny what our own traditions have confirmed." He turned toward Ethan and Saralyn, eyes sharp. "But our culture is not ready. Our people will question. Some will rage, many will fear." Saralyn stepped forward. "Then let them." Gasps rippled through the chamber. She stood tall, eyes flashing. "We are scientists, diplomats, explorers. If we fear what is new, we do not evolve. If we shame what is natural, we lose ourselves. My bond with Ethan was not designed, nor desired, nor negotiated. But it is real, and if we are to become more than what we were, we must stop hiding behind fear." She reached for Ethan's hand. He took it. The room held its breath. Ambassador Leora stood again. "The Earth delegation accepts the bond, in full recognition of Vidian law. We propose a joint initiative, an interspecies research program, co-led by both parties, to study and guide future instances of this compatibility." There were protests, pushback. But momentum had already begun, and history once in motion rarely stops. After the meeting, the two of them sat alone in the observation deck, overlooking the core of Nexus Station. Below them, ships docked and departed, lights blinking like quiet stars. "It started," Ethan said. Saralyn leaned her head against his shoulder. "It has. The change. Yes." He hesitated. "Does it scare you?" "A little," she admitted. "Me too." But neither moved, because somewhere in that silence, they understood something unspoken. Their bond was no longer just between two people. It was a doorway, one they had walked through together. When history writes your name before you're ready, what do? Do you live up to the myth, or do you stay true to the truth? Ethan Cole stood in silence as the ceremonial chamber's outer doors sealed behind him. The air was heavier than usual, not because of atmosphere. Nexus Station's regulators were perfect, but because of what waited inside. This was no longer a place for trial. It had become a court. He wasn't on trial for a crime, but for breaking an expectation. Saralyn stood at his side, as she always had since the beginning of this strange, accidental journey. But now her face was tighter, her jaw set, her hands at her sides, not trembling, not afraid, but rigid, ready. They had been summoned by the Vidian High Conclave. Not the local representatives on Nexus, but the full delegation from their homeworld, who had arrived 2 cycles ago aboard a gilded diplomatic cruiser the size of a small city. Their arrival had silenced every hallway on the station. It was no longer just about compatibility, it was about inheritance. And Saralyn, biologist, reformist, accidental bondmate, was still the first daughter of Grand Marshal Voren. And now, thanks to that very bond, she was threatening to unravel a political marriage arranged over a decade ago. A marriage that was supposed to unite 2 of the most powerful bloodlines in the Vidian hierarchy. Ethan understood that. He didn't need Saralyn to explain it. He had seen the look on Voren's face when he first reached out to take her hand in the last trial. The expression of a father who had lost not just control, but narrative. Today's meeting wasn't a conversation, it was a reckoning. Inside, the chamber was filled with tiers of seated Vidian elders, their garments layered in colors that denoted both lineage and discipline. Healers in white and gold, lawmakers in emerald and bronze, warriors in black and crimson. Each of them stared down as if peering into a microscope, trying to understand the anomaly before them. Voren stood at the base of the semicircle, not at its center. His position had changed. A silent message. He looked older than he had 2 days ago. His armor polished, but his shoulders slumped beneath it. Yet, when he turned to face his daughter and her bondmate, his voice had not lost its strength. "The conclave has gathered," he said, "to determine the legitimacy and consequence of the bond between Saralyn of House Voren and Ethan Cole of Earth." There were no murmurs, no whispers, only the stillness of ceremony. Saralyn stepped forward. "My bond is not political," she said. "Nor is it accidental. It is real, sacred by our own laws, recognized by the crystals, witnessed by the station, and confirmed by the trials. If we deny it now, we deny not just our tradition, but our evolution." A high elder spoke from the 3rd tier. "And what of your original betrothal? The one meant to seal peace between House Voren and the House of Thal?" Saralyn's voice was calm. "A peace built on paper, not purpose. If they seek unity, let it be through action, not genetics." Another elder, older still, narrowed her eyes. "And this human, what does he bring to your people? To your future?" Ethan didn't wait for Saralyn to answer. He stepped forward. "I bring nothing that can be calculated on a ledger," he said. "I'm not wealthy. I don't carry political weight. I wasn't even supposed to be in that gym." A few heads tilted, but he kept going. "What I offer is what I chose. I chose to stay. I chose to listen. I chose to walk every step of your ancient trials, not because I had to, but because I believed something rare had happened, something that deserved more than silence." He paused. "I may be an outsider to your customs, but I know what it means to stand for something when the easier option is to walk away. And I'm still here." Silence followed. Then Voren lifted a hand. "There is precedent," he said. "It is ancient, rarely invoked, but still binding. The right of declaration. If a bonded pair completes the trials and presents themselves before the conclave without denial or hesitation, the bond may override prior obligations, provided it is acknowledged by both bloodline heads." The chamber stirred. Ethan heard the subtle meaning. Saralyn's part was clear. Now it was Voren's. The entire chamber watched as the Grand Marshal turned to his daughter. He didn't speak for a long time. The silence stretched, echoing against the high dome above them. Then, with a voice roughened by something close to sorrow, he said, "You were never just my legacy." Saralyn's breath caught. Voren looked at Ethan. "She chose you, and you didn't run." He turned back to the conclave. "I, Voren of House Voren, acknowledge the bond." The words fell into the room like the quietest thunder. No applause, no celebration. But in the language of Vidians, silence was often louder than approval. Later, back in the private alcoves of the diplomatic wing, Saralyn stood with Ethan beneath the artificial stars of the garden dome. The plants around them glowed faintly, absorbing and releasing light as if breathing in sync. "You didn't have to say all that," she said. "I know." She leaned into him. "He gave us his blessing. Sort of." "He let go," Ethan corrected. "That's harder." They stood there for a long time, just the two of them, a bond that had defied science, expectation, and politics, not because they planned it, but because neither of them ran when the galaxy expected them to, when all the ceremonies are done, when the lights dim and the names are recorded in history. What's left? Is it peace? Is it love? Or is it the simple decision to stay every single day? The garden swayed beneath Viridia's twin suns, real sunlight, real wind. Not the artificial breeze of Nexus Station or the glowing humidity of hydroponic domes. This was a living world. Her world. Ethan Cole stood on the upper balcony of the ancestral estate of House Voren, his eyes tracing the curve of a distant violet sea as waves lapped against ancient stone. The light shimmered across the fields of bioluminescent vines below, casting long, soft shadows behind the towering crystal sculptures that marked generations of rulers, scholars, and warriors. And now, him. It had been 3 months since the bond had been declared. 3 months since the trials, the confrontation, and the choice. The world hadn't changed overnight, but it had started to shift. At first, their bond had been a curiosity, then a controversy, and now something else entirely. An anchor. Behind him, the doors slid open without sound. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. The rhythm of her steps had already carved a place in his bones. Saralyn wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek against his shoulder. "Morning," she whispered. "It is now." She chuckled softly. "You're still not used to the real sun, are you?" "It's too honest," he said. "Hard to hide anything in this kind of light." She stepped beside him, her silver hair loose in the breeze, the faint golden edge of her ceremonial robe catching the wind. That's the point. Below them, diplomats and scientists from both Earth and Viridia walk the pathways of the new research institute. A collaboration born from the bond, studying interspecies resonance, behavioral triggers, and something far more elusive, harmony. They'd already found 3 other pairs who reacted to each other on a similar frequency. None had undergone the same trials, but the foundation was there. Ethan adjusted the collar of his formal uniform. Today, they were expected to address the new Council of Integration, not just as symbols, but as policymakers. Still, something kept him here, frozen in the morning air, thinking. "Do you miss it?" Saralyn asked. "Miss what?" "Being unknown," he smiled. "I was never unknown, just unimportant." "You were important to me before any of this," she said. "You still are." He turned to face her, eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "That this wasn't just the bond, the biology? That if I hadn't been sweating in that gym, we wouldn't be here?" She didn't laugh. Instead, she reached up and placed her hand against his chest. "I've spent a lifetime chasing things I could prove. Data, patterns, genetic markers, but not everything real comes with a chart. Some things you feel, like breath, like gravity, like home." He covered her hand with his. "We did this backwards," he said. "Maybe," she replied. "Or maybe we did it right. We didn't fall for the surface. We went through the worst of each other before we ever kissed." They stood in silence again, not because they had nothing to say, but because some truths didn't need to be spoken anymore. That night, after the reception, after the formal speeches, after the soft nods of dignitaries and quiet approval of elders, Ethan returned to their shared quarters. The estate had been modernized slightly to accommodate his physiology, but the bones of it remained untouched. Still Vidian, still sacred. In their private chamber, the lights dimmed to a violet hue. Music played from a stringed instrument he could barely pronounce the name of. And across the room, Saralyn waited for him. No longer in robes or ceremony, but in comfort, in closeness. He crossed the floor, took her hands in his, and said nothing. Because after everything, the only truth that mattered was that she was still here. So was he. And tomorrow they would continue building something neither culture had ever dared imagine. Would you have stayed? Would you have said yes? Not once, but every single day after? Let us know in the comments. And thank you for walking this journey with us. From a single drop of sweat to something that might just change the stars.